Hey everyone, welcome back to Essentials. Today, we're diving into the European Union, why it matters, the criticisms, and what it needs to do to win back trust. We'll cover bananas, big tech, armies, and currencies. Joining me is Carly Jensen. Carly, welcome.
Thanks, Carver. This is such an important conversation, especially now with everything happening globally. Hopefully, the current situation has given the EU a wake-up call. The EU has its flaws, but it's more relevant than ever.
Let's kick things off. With all the geopolitical chaos, Trump, Russia, China, Elon Musk, why does the EU matter? Why should people care?
Because the EU gives Europe the scale and power it needs to matter on the global stage. Individually, EU countries are relatively small. Even Germany or France can't compete with the US or China on their own. But together, the EU is an economic and political giant.
And when you say economic giant, what are we talking about?
The EU has one of the largest single markets in the world, 450 million people. That's huge. Let's compare sizes. The US GDP is $25.5 trillion. The Chinese GDP is $19.4 trillion, the same as the EU. Germany on its own is $4.5 trillion and France $3.4. You understand the difference. The EU size means businesses can trade freely across borders, and the EU can set global standards. Think about data privacy. The EU's GDPR didn't just impact Europe, it forced tech companies worldwide to change how they operate.
I'm glad you mentioned big tech. The EU has been tough on US tech companies. Google, Facebook, Amazon. Why does that matter?
Because someone has to hold these companies accountable. The EU has passed groundbreaking laws like GDPR, which protects people's data, and more recently the DMA and DSA, the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. These laws crack down on monopolistic practices and force big tech to be more transparent.
So the EU is taking on big tech in a way others aren't?
Exactly. The US under Trump does not want to regulate its own companies, and China has its own tech giants operating under state control. The EU is leading the charge to make sure these companies don't abuse their power, and that benefits people everywhere, not just in Europe.
Okay, so the EU's doing some good stuff. But let's address a big criticism: democracy, or the lack of it. A lot of people say the EU doesn't have a proper democratic mandate. What's your take on that?
It's a valid criticism. The European Parliament is directly elected by the people, but the real power lies with the European Commission, and that's appointed by state leaders, not voters. It creates this feeling that decisions are being made by bureaucrats in Brussels instead of by the people.
And that's where the frustration comes from, right? People feel disconnected from the process?
Exactly. When people see decisions being made about things like fishing quotas or the size of bananas, they feel like they don't have a say. The EU needs to make sure it focuses on the real important stuff, not on trivialities. And the EU needs to find a way to make its institutions more accountable to its citizens if it wants to regain trust.
All right, let's pivot to defense. A European army? Why do people say the EU needs one when NATO already exists?
Because relying on NATO means relying on the US, and that's risky. Trump openly questioned NATO's value. What happens if he indeed draws back from NATO? Europe can't afford to depend entirely on the US. A European army would allow the EU to defend itself, respond faster to crises, and assert its independence. The EU has to ensure that its citizens can feel safe in a turbulent world. Safe against Russia, China, but also the US.
But wouldn't that cost a fortune?
Not necessarily. EU countries already spend $295 billion in 2023 on defense, but it's fragmented. Everyone's duplicating efforts, buying their own tanks, jets, and systems. A unified European army would be more efficient and save money in the long run.
And the $295 billion, is that enough?
Well, it is a start, but do note that the US spends $916 billion per year. China spends the same as the EU on military, while Russia stops at $130 billion in 2023. So it is okay but needs to increase further, unfortunately. These figures show the military dominance of the US. It spends more than the next following 9 countries combined.
Okay, let's switch gears to the economy. You've talked about Europe's financial system being fragmented. What's the issue there?
The problem is that the EU doesn't have a unified capital market. In the US, businesses can raise money quickly because the financial system is massive and integrated. In the EU, companies face 27 different sets of rules, which makes it harder to get funding. We saw the military dominance of the US, but there is also a financial dominance. Look at the US stock markets. Its market capitalization counts for 42.5% of the world value. The same goes for the bond market. There, the US counts for 45%. The EU and China have roughly the same weighting, 20% each. It seems that economically and military, the EU and China are each other equals. Only problem is that the EU is fragmented.
So how do you fix that?
The EU needs to create a single European capital market. That would make it easier for businesses to raise money, which drives innovation and creates jobs. It's also key to making the euro a stronger international reserve currency.
But why hasn't it become a global reserve currency like the US dollar?
The euro is close, but it's held back by two things. First, the lack of a unified capital market, which we just talked about. Second, the EU still relies too much on the US for defense and energy. That undermines confidence in the euro as a truly independent currency.
So what would it take to make the euro a global powerhouse?
The EU needs to integrate its financial markets and strengthen its geopolitical position through energy independence, defense, and innovation. If the EU gets those things right, the euro could rival the dollar and give Europe more influence in global trade.
All right, Carly, let's bring it all together. If the EU builds a European army, unifies its capital markets, and strengthens the euro, what's the end game?
The end game is a Europe that can stand on its own. A Europe that's not just following the US or reacting to China, but leading on global issues: security, trade, climate change. But for that to happen, the EU needs to fix its democratic deficit and focus on the big issues that actually matter to people. And very importantly, national governments need to transfer their powers to Brussels. As long as they want their own steering wheel in Berlin, Paris, and Rome, it will be difficult.
And now even more difficult.
Indeed, especially with Trump trying to divide the EU as much as possible. He doesn't want the EU to become more powerful.
Final question. How does the EU win back its critics and get people more engaged?
3 things. First, stop over-regulating the little stuff. No more bananas. Focus on big, meaningful issues like defense, jobs, and big tech. Second, make its institutions more democratic. If people feel like they have a real voice and they feel safe in Europe, they're more likely to support the EU and show up to vote. And thirdly, make it clear that the EU can protect its citizens from the geopolitical chaos. If its citizens feel safe and secure in the EU, they will get more engaged.
Carly, this has been eye-opening. The EU has its flaws, but the stakes are too high to ignore it.
Exactly. The EU isn't perfect, but it's essential. If it focuses on what really matters, becomes more accountable, and provides protection, it can be a force for good, not just for Europe, but for the world.
What do you think, folks? Does the EU need its own army? Should the euro rival the dollar? And what about those big tech regulations? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this conversation useful, hit like, share it, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives.
Thanks for having me, Carver. And thanks to everyone watching this episode of Essentials. Your voice matters in shaping Europe's future.
See you next time. Stay curious.